Good. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. This is the first session of the summer school, and I think it follows on nicely from Yilmaz's discussion that we've just completed. In particular, we've always in UNCTAD recognized that developing countries are operating in a world that is not of their making and is in too many respects is often posing a challenge for the objectives that policymakers in the South are pursuing. And therefore, the evolution of the post-war international economic order has always been very much at the forefront of the way in which we frame the development thinking and the development challenge. And so I thought it would be a very nice way to kick off by bringing together some scholars who have made important contributions to thinking about the evolution of the international economic order and the role, to some extent, of UNCTAD as a player in that order. And so for today's discussion, we have three great panelists. Eric Helleiner. We will begin with Eric. Eric is the professor of political science at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's written extensively on the governance of the international system, particularly on the financial dimensions and challenges that poses to developing countries. And he's in particular written a wonderful book that I recommend to everybody on the forgotten foundations of Bretton Woods, about the issues that were under discussion in the 1930s and 40s in the run-up and during the Bretton Woods Conference, particularly around development challenges that were somehow put to one side in the subsequent operations of the system as it morphed out of the Second World War. I have to say it wasn't forgotten by everybody. Indeed, UNCTAD to some extent comes out of that forgotten history. Raoul Prebisch, who founded UNCTAD, was of course an important figure in the discussions that Eric recalls in that volume. And so this is, I think, a great place to think about the development challenges, the role of UNCTAD in the evolution of the post-war system. So Eric, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Is the volume good? Everybody hear me? Richard, is that good? Yeah, okay. Great, so it's a great honor to be part of the summer school, and thanks so much to Richard for inviting me and for that nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about the origins of the Bretton Woods system and a little bit about how it evolved near the end of this quick talk. And what I really want to try to do is to highlight two myths that have emerged around the Bretton Woods meetings, which I think it's really important to understand how they are myths and how understanding them as myths helps us to understand the current period in some better ways. So the first one is that the Bretton Woods architects were not interested in international development. And that's a very common view. If you pick up textbooks about the Bretton Woods Conference, it'll often say developing countries were not really at the conference, or if they were, they didn't play much of a role, and that the British and the Americans kind of dominated the whole thing, and that they themselves weren't interested in development issues. And I want to show you the extent to which that was incorrect, and in fact, highlight the extent to which issues we're still debating today were debated very extensively at the Bretton Woods meetings. And some of the issues that were raised there were particularly interesting ones that have contemporary relevance. And then the second myth is one which I've already mentioned briefly, which is that the Bretton Woods meeting was largely dominated by the Americans and by the British. This is kind of story about Harry Dexter White, the lead American negotiator, and John Maynard Keynes as the lead British negotiator, that it was essentially the negotiations were between those two men and their officials. And again, I think that's an incorrect way to look at the meetings, and I'll highlight in a second the extent to which many other countries are involved and had important ideas. And in particular, what I want to emphasize is the role of China at the meetings, which in fact had the second largest delegation at the conference, even though it's usually not mentioned. And I want to highlight some of the things that the Chinese were raising in 1944, which I think have enormous relevance as China is emerging as one of the largest contributors to international development finance in the current era. So let me just begin then with the first myth about the fact that so many people think Bretton Woods did not discuss development issues. What I just want to highlight here is the extent to which development goals were in fact at the core of the Bretton Woods meetings. In fact, the US plans, which began in about 1942, just after Pearl Harbor, the plans were incredibly ambitious in their vision of how they were going to construct the first ever kind of multilateral framework in which development issues would be seen as central to that framework. And in many ways, Michael's going to talk a little bit later about the new international economic order debates in the 1970s. Many issues that were at the center of those debates and that UNCTAD itself promoted in the 1960s and 70s were also central to the American vision in the early 1940s. Let me just give you some examples. Long-term development finance was seen as a crucial goal of the Bretton Woods meetings, so the construction of the World Bank. Sometimes people say the World Bank didn't have development lending at its core. It was mainly designed to reconstruct Europe after the war, but that's an incorrect view. At the very core of the American vision of the Bretton Woods was both reconstruction and development, hence its initial title, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There's also a lot of discussion about balance of payments finance and the unique problems that Southern countries have, especially as commodity exporting countries. And so there's a sense in which they needed generous balance of payments finance through the IMF, which was being created at the Bretton Woods meetings, and also with no conditionality. There's a lot of discussion about the need for policy space. You know, this is a current, obviously an issue of enormous relevance today, and especially policy space for state-led industrialization. So the endorsement of adjustable exchange rate pegs, the endorsement in Bretton Woods of capital controls, all of these things were linked to a vision that the Americans had, that state-led industrialization was something that would be important to the post-war order. And what's even more striking is that the Americans sent advisors at that time in the mid-1940s to many Latin American countries, to the Philippines, to Ethiopia, in fact, giving this advice to countries saying, we're constructing a multilateral order in which we hope that state-led industrialization can happen, and we will even come and give you specific advice about how to do that. And so Robert Triffin, who will be known to those of you who are familiar with the history of international economics, was leading many of his missions, and in the Latin American context, working very closely with Raul Prebisch. So it's really quite striking. Now, I just want to mention a couple of other things that were discussed by the early American plans, but not in fact implemented in the final agreement, but it's striking the extent to which they were even being discussed. So one was that the IMF could play a role in compulsory arbitration of debt restructuring. Another was commodity price stabilization, that the World Bank would play a role of organizing and financing a kind of international commodity stabilization corporation. A third was an explicit endorsement in the early American plans of the need for infant industry protectionism. And the language is incredibly strong. So Harry Dexter White, for example, the lead American negotiator, said, you know, this is just a quote, he says, free trade theory grossly underestimates the extent to which a country can virtually lift itself up by its bootstraps in one generation if it is willing to pay the price. He said free trade theory assumptions were, quote, not valid. They were unreal and unsound. They assumed that a country chiefly agricultural in its economy has as many economic, political, and social advantages as a country whose economy is chiefly industrial. So, you know, there's a real sense in which there needed to be industrialization. So overall, the vision was one very much supportive of the idea of wealthier countries helping poorer countries. So let me just give you a quote from Henry Morgenthau, who was the US Treasury Secretary at the meeting. And he says, the Bretton Woods approach is based on the realization that it is very much to the economic and political advantage of countries such as India and China, and also of countries such as England and the United States, that the industrialization and betterment of living conditions in the former, meaning India and China, be achieved with the aid and the encouragement of the latter, meaning England and the United States. So very much a vision of development. You can still read books that sometimes say Bretton Woods was uninterested in issues of poverty, And here I just want to read you another quote from Morgenthau at the conference where he said, "Prosperity like peace is indivisible. We cannot afford to have it scattered here or there among the fortunate or to enjoy it at the expense of others. Poverty, wherever it exists, is menacing to us all and undermines the well-being of each of us." So again, just to reinforce the sense, this is a very strong vision of international development is at the Bretton Woods Conference. Now, what I also want to highlight is the extent to which that was a big innovation in global governance. So this idea of constructing a multilateral order with development at its core. If you take, for example, the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War, there's really almost no discussion of international development, with one exception I'll mention in a second, coming from China. If you think of what international institutions existed before the Bretton Woods Conference, they didn't have development mandates. So there was, an international financial institution, the Bank for International Settlements, was created in the early 1930s, but it doesn't have development as its mandate. And so this is really a new vision that's being constructed at Bretton Woods. And if you try to understand the source of that innovation, because it really was a dramatic innovation in global governance, I think you really have to think about Franklin Roosevelt, the US president at the time, and his vision of 4 freedoms, of which one of the freedoms was freedom from want everywhere in the world. That's the way he expressed it. And he had his famous 4 Freedoms speech in 1941, which he wrote almost entirely by himself, and which included that passage about the need to promote freedom from want everywhere in the world. And at the time, one of his officials even said, "Are you sure you mean everywhere?" And the official said, "Are Americans really interested in the people of Java, for example?" And Roosevelt apparently responded, "I am afraid they'll have to be someday. The world is getting so small that even the people in Java are getting to be our neighbors now." And so it's really this very global vision of freedom from want. And so what's the motivation? It's partly a kind of a New Deal ideology that economic security, the provision of economic security to individuals around the world will help the cause of peace, in a sense that fascism had emerged in the 1930s from economic trouble. And so this is initially a vision that Roosevelt has within the United States. If he can provide economic security to people, that will bring political stability. And then he kind of globalizes it in the context of thinking about the post-war world. And so the early plans are described by Harry Dexter White, for example, as a New Deal in international economics. I think there's also a vision of mutual gains. So the US officials are saying, if there's industrialization in other parts of the world, that will help us in terms of providing new markets or new places to invest. And Roosevelt himself promotes that idea very actively. And then I think there is a broader kind of sense of justice that a lot of the New Deal officials had. They had addressed poverty, they tried to address poverty in the United States, and now they're taking it kind of globally. Okay, so that's the first myth. Second myth is just to highlight the extent to which that vision is not coming just from the United States. And I can say, I should also mention Bretton here. Keynes, famous thinker, well, I think it's fair to say was not terribly interested in development issues compared to the American officials. And so when people say, the Bretton Woods meeting was just an American-British deal, if you hold that view, the development side was really coming mostly from the Americans. But what I want to do is challenge that view and show the extent to which there were many other countries who were at the meetings who played important roles. And this has really been marginalized in the history of Bretton Woods. So the most famous book initially on Bretton Woods was a book called Sterling Dollar Diplomacy, as if there were only 2 countries, but there were 44 different delegations at Bretton Woods, of which the British and Americans were only 2. And the majority of those were from countries that we might call today the global South. So Latin America, for example, had 19 of the 44 delegations. Only Argentina was not represented. And so to go to Richard's point, Raoul Prebisch is very involved with the Americans at this time, but he's not at the Bretton Woods meetings because he's from Argentina, and Argentina was not invited because of its political position at that time. But many other Latin American countries had major roles. So Brazil, Mexico, these are playing a major role at the conference. Mexico, for example, chairs one of the major commissions at the Bretton Woods meetings. And those countries had been pushing since the early 1930s for the construction of multilateral institutions that had development at their core. And so these are ideas not coming just from the United States. In fact, someone like Harry Dexter White was very much encouraged to think about the idea of international development through a pressure from Latin American countries. He had worked in Latin America from the late 1930s onwards. And interestingly, the model for the IMF and the World Bank, in fact, came out of a proposal that Harry Dexter White negotiated with Latin American countries in the early 1940s, just before the Bretton Woods negotiations began, which was never created, but it created a kind of a model for later discussions. So who else was there? India played a major role, although it's still a colony at that time. The British allowed half of the delegation to be Indians. Most of them were Indian nationals at the time. And they're pushing very much for the idea of an international conference that has development at its core. There were less countries from Africa. Most colonized countries from Africa were not represented at the conference, but Ethiopia is there, Liberia is there, Egypt is there. All of those countries were pushing for development issues. Some East European countries at the conference, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, for example, they are also very interested, especially the Poles, in pushing international development. And then I just want to mention quickly the role of China, because China, in that book, for example, Sterling Dollar Diplomacy, a very famous book, China's not even in the index. And yet China had the second largest delegation at the conference. And interestingly, the Chinese very much saw themselves as kind of leaders of poor countries at the conference. And in particular, what they're interested in doing is pushing for the idea of international development finance. And what they do when they begin the conference is they hold a kind of a press conference in which the lead Chinese delegate says, what we really want to see is an implementation of something that was called for after World War I in the lead up to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which was a call by Sun Yat-sen, the great Chinese nationalist leader, who wrote a book around that time called The International Development of China, in which he called for an international institution that would provide development finance to China, not to other countries, just to China. And the Chinese then come to Bretton Woods and they say, look, what we're trying to do is do what Sun Yat-sen had unsuccessfully lobbied for around the time of the Paris Peace Conference. He had wanted the idea of a multilateral support for development finance, and it wasn't successful. Nobody listened to him. Because Sun Yat-sen had no role at the conference at the time. But they say, this is what we want to do this time. And these are nationalist figures in the Chinese political context at the time, but it's important to recognize that even Mao is endorsing the idea of international development finance at that time, and often invoking Sun Yat-sen's ideas as well. Sun Yat-sen is a figure within China who was supported by both the communists and also by the nationalists at that time. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are many countries who are at the conference who are not just playing, they're not passive spectators, they're actively involved and they're actively pushing the idea of international development. This is not just a Northern idea. And they're very involved. And so it's important to recognize the extent to which that meeting was a multilateral meeting, not a bilateral one between the British and the Americans, but a multilateral one. And the Americans themselves were very committed to this idea of a multilateral order. You have to remember the conference itself took place during the war, and so they're interested in having all of the allies there participating. And I think they also have a broader sense of the need for multilateralism in keeping with Roosevelt's idea of freedom from want everywhere in the world. So remember the quote I had earlier, poverty wherever it exists is menacing to us all. Okay. I don't have a lot more time, so let me just quickly sum up this history and then say a few things about its more contemporary relevance. So the two core points I've tried to highlight for you here. One is that international development was very much a focus of the Bretton Woods meetings. It pioneered all kinds of innovations in global governance to put development issues more at the center of the agenda. And secondly, that push was not just coming from the American side, to a lesser extent to the British side, but from many countries at the conference who themselves saw them as potential recipients of international development assistance or of other ways in which the Bretton Woods Conference might help their state-led industrialization plans. Okay, let me just quickly say something about what happened to that vision. There was a dramatic change in US policy right after the war. After Roosevelt dies, many New Deal figures in the US administration lose influence. And then very quickly there's a changed security context. First of all, the fact that the war itself ended meant that a lot of poorer countries who had been involved in the Bretton Woods negotiations kind of lost their leverage, which had been part of being allies in the war. And then the Cold War begins in 1947-48, and the focus of American policy becomes much more on Europe and security concerns. China also exits the Bretton Woods system with the revolution in 1949. And so the whole political context has changed in a way that the vision of Bretton Woods, which is this very ambitious kind of vision, gets diluted. And so the Bretton Woods institutions themselves, the IMF and the World Bank, have scaled back, increasingly pushing much more orthodox liberal ideas as opposed to this more kind of support for state-led development growth. And although there is still an idea of international development, so President Truman famously has a speech in 1949, where he outlines a vision of development. It's much more limited. It's kind of technical assistance and a fair bit of skepticism in American circles at that time about state-led development now, because of the Cold War, which is pitching things as, you know, you're either a statist or you're free market, and there's nothing in the middle. And many of the people at Bretton Woods had a more kind of third middle position of state-led industrialization. And so a lot of the ambitious ideas of Bretton Woods get put to the side, or at least diluted very dramatically. And that's the source of a lot of the debates that then come up in the 50s and the 60s, and that I think Michael's going to talk about in a second, in the 1970s, the frustration of many Southern countries about the nature of the Bretton Woods order, that it does not seem very development friendly. There's not very much development finance. It's conditional. There's not very much policy space. There's no provisions for debt restructuring. There's no interest in commodity price stabilization. There's no support for import substitution industrialization. They don't have much voice in these institutions. You know, all of these complaints come up in the 50s and 60s, and UNCTAD plays a major role in putting them on the international agenda. But in many ways, what they were doing was calling for things that had been endorsed at the Bretton Woods Conference, but were then marginalized after the war. And so it's a very unusual political situation that involves in that post-war period. Now, what I just want to finish up by is highlighting the extent to which these issues, you know, are still on the agenda. Issues that were debated in 1944, and many creative ideas were put forward in 1944, and yet here we are still debating them today. I think you can learn some interesting things. I just want to highlight a couple in particular, and then talk about the Chinese role for 1 second, and then I'll finish. So one issue I just want to mention is the issue of capital flight, which was discussed extensively by the Bretton Woods negotiators, and the Americans in particular. Very interesting ideas about how countries receiving capital flight should play some role in helping those that were experiencing capital flight in order to trace those assets and get them returned. And that's an issue which, you know, remains central to many people interested in development, and Bretton Woods has some interesting ideas about that. The other one is about debt restructuring. And so I mentioned already that the IMF was in fact given a role in early American plans to do mandatory debt restructuring. And obviously that issue is at the center of many debates today. And it's useful to know that the Bretton Woods Conference talked about the importance of that. Now, finally, the role of China. I just want to highlight the extent to which I think it's important to recognize the Chinese role at Bretton Woods, because China today is a major contributor of international development finance. And interestingly, Chinese leaders continue today to talk about Sun Yat-sen's vision, which was put forward after World War I, which is a vision of multilateral development finance. It was a relatively limited vision that finance was just for China. But today, many Chinese leaders have said, you know, Sun pioneered the idea of international development finance, and that's why we are very supportive of it. And I think it's very important for people outside China who aren't familiar with the intellectual history of China and Chinese political economy to recognize this deep roots of an interest in international development finance, especially one coming from such a prominent figure as Sun Yat-sen. And so when Xi Jinping, for example, will talk about Sun Yat-sen as a major figure, and that the Chinese leadership sees themselves as inheriting some of the ideas of Sun Yat-sen, it's important to recognize that those ideas also included support for international development. Okay, I'll stop there. I hope that was the history is useful for you and interesting to you, and I welcome any comments or questions.
Very great, thanks. There are some very specific questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you could go in and take a look at them if possible, because I think it's good to, I want to move on straight away to Michael, because in a way, a lot of what you leave hanging is the evolution of US hegemony in the post-war period is how a lot of the debates, the prism through which the debates that are forgotten, or indeed the debates that are raised, gets distorted or channeled through a changing nature of US hegemony. And I think Michael's work kind of picks up in an important way that speaks to a lot of the concerns that you mentioned there that were dropped and to a certain extent resurfaced through the new international economic order discussions that UNCTAD led in the 1970s, but was a UN-wide process, of course. So I'm going to move on to Michael, and maybe we'll come back to this in the more general discussion. But if there are specific questions aimed at your presentation as well, Eric. Michael Franczak is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and essentially, I think, Michael, a historian of US hegemony. And I think particularly in your forthcoming book, a historian of the new international economic order and the way it shaped United States foreign policy and of course, the way that United States foreign policy, I think, to be honest, ultimately undermined the discussions around the new international economic order and shifted the global economy in very profound ways in the early 1980s. And this is very important to people in UNCTAD because, in a sense, that was our golden era. I mean, that was when UNCTAD really was in the 70s trying to fashion a different set of rules of the game and picking up on the various issues that Eric rightly recognized were dropped from the discussions, the initial discussions around Brentwood. So I give you the floor, and I look forward to hearing your take on these issues.
Great, thank you, Richard. And as you suggested, Eric did set me up really well for my talk. So before I get into the subject of the talk in the book, which is American Foreign Policy Toward the New International Economic Order, or NEO as they called it at the time, I want to give a little background. As Eric suggested, the NEO's roots go back to the post-war settlement into developing countries' frustrations and concerns and contributions, frankly, at Bretton Woods. Already there was widespread dissatisfaction and arguments against the lack of development content, the assumption of fixed international division of labor, and the problems of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, commodity price stabilization, debt negotiation, all the issues that Eric raised. However, it's not until the 1960s that a major pro-South program of reforms to the global economy coheres. And that's primarily through the contributions of UNCTAD. Under Raoul Prevish's leadership, UNCTAD functioned for the developing countries, or Group of 77, as kind of an alternative GATT, where they could strategize together and caucus to change the rules of trade and finance in their favor, or at least get a better seat at the bargaining table. Now, the NEO took form as a legal document at UNCTAD 3, held in Santiago, Chile in 1972. This is where Mexican President Luis Echeverria put forth a Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States that went to the UN and was approved by the General Assembly 2 years later. However, the event that pushes the NEO from idea to practice, the story goes, is the 1973 oil crisis. Now, this was also years in the works due to failed negotiations between producers, consumers, and multinational oil companies. But for many in the South, it showed that they had real economic power against the North, despite the fact that much of the South imported oil. So on May 1st, 1974, International Labor Day, very deliberately, the president of Algeria, Houari Boumediene, also an OPEC leader, presented to a special session of the UN the call for a new international economic order, quote, based on equity and sovereign equality and designed to correct inequalities and redress existing injustices. So this is very much about the past and about the 20 or 30 years of so-called golden age capitalism in which the gains accrued primarily to the North. So I can get into specifics later, but basically the goal of the Neo was to renegotiate or to negotiate a redistribution of money and power from the North to the South. And the South's weapon was control over the price of major commodities, particularly oil, that had made possible the US and Europe's spectacular prosperity after World War II. So what happened to the Neo and North-South dialogue? US policymakers had an obvious interest in defeating the Neo, or at least rendering it toothless, but perception is reality. And the perception up until 1982 was that the breakdown of the North-South dialogue negotiations could sabotage the West's fragile post-1973 economic recovery. So more specifically, what was the North-South dialogue's legacy for American foreign policy as it moved out of the crisis-ridden 1970s and into a new era of globalization and post-Cold War triumphalism, which we've discussed a bit already. So here's the argument I lay out in my book. Through the 1973 oil crisis and call for a new international economic order in 1974, third world countries made global inequality a major threat to US national security. Now, this call for economic decolonization had nothing to do with East-West relations. The Soviets were content to sit on the sidelines and say this is an imperial problem caused by the imperial powers, therefore they should pay for it. And China tries to get in the game, but doesn't get much traction. So no communist country is a significant actor, which means that with the exception of Yugoslavia, some have made arguments about it, but for the most part, the communist countries have no part in this because it's about the global capitalist order. So this means that US foreign policy community begins for the first time to imagine a post-Cold War world order, where it's divided not between capitalism and communism, but rich and poor. And I conclude that US policy debates and decisions toward the Neo and North-South dialogue were pivotal moments in the histories of three ideological trends: neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and human rights, that would form the core of America's post-Cold War foreign policy. So first, neoliberalism, many definitions of neoliberalism. For our purposes, I define it as a political project in the late 1970s and 80s, mostly in Western countries, and especially in the United States, that sought to dismantle the post-World War II economic consensus that was broadly pro-intervention, pro-redistribution, and committed to full employment, and replace it with a so-called classical liberal vision of minimal government intervention, limited social welfare, and market deregulation. Now, one of the most common explanations for the rise of neoliberal economic thought in the 1970s is that Keynesianism, the dominant post-war model, had no answer to the central economic challenge of the time for developed countries: stagflation, or high inflation without growth. However, I found that one of the key issues animating early neoliberals, who, though outside mainstream economic thought at the time, were very prominent in Gerald Ford's cabinet, was the Neo. So, US Treasury Secretary William Simon and economic advisors William Seidman and Alan Greenspan, someone who will come back later, all three resolutely oppose the strategy of Henry Kissinger, who was Ford's Secretary of State. His strategy was to promote Keynesian stimulus in rich countries and limited concessions on trade and aid to poor countries, which Kissinger believed was the best way to split the South and hold the North together. Kissinger was not sympathetic to the Neo, but he believed that outright opposition to it would further alienate US allies in Western Europe at a crucial time in transatlantic relations. Much more dependent on Middle East oil and more open to government intervention, by late 1974, most European states had cut separate deals with Middle East oil producers and had suggested a willingness to engage in North-South negotiations with or without the US. As Kissinger told Ford at the time, if we insist on theoretical positions in the dialogue, the Germans will not follow us on raw materials. They will not follow us on a confrontation course with the LDCs. If they won't, neither will France, Great Britain, or Japan. Indeed, this was one of the primary reasons for the establishment of the yearly Group of Seven summits, where in November 1975, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson feared, quote, more PECs, banana PECs, phosphate PECs, aluminum PECs, were the West not to offer a, in his words, Marshall Plan-like initiative to the South. Kissinger called the neoliberals' unflinching opposition to concessions economic theology. The neoliberals charged back that Kissinger's endorsement of government intervention abroad was sabotaging their own deregulatory crusade at home. I also show that Kissinger's clash with Ford's market revolutionaries had important implications for how we eat. Food historians have memorialized US Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz for his radical consolidation of American food production. If you've seen like Food Inc. or the big documentaries, they show him telling small farmers in the 1970s to go big or get out by planting corn and soybeans fence row to fence row. Butz's dismantling of the New Deal system of production controls and price supports was predicated on an ever-expanding overseas market for US food exports. So this carried major foreign policy implications. In the midst of a global food and energy crisis, Butz aligned himself with Greenspan, Simon, and other market fundamentalists to block proposals within the US government and United Nations for a sort of global food bank, and to push instead for the liberalization of food markets and the primacy of private enterprise. This made poor countries more dependent on US food exports and further stimulated the consolidation of American farms and the homogenization of diets around the world. My second argument is that the debate over the neo fueled the rise of neoconservatism in the United States. While William Simon and Alan Greenspan focused on the economic principles at stake, another set of actors, at the time largely outside of government, saw an even greater threat emanating from the South. The neo-conflict was not simply a battle between rich and poor nations, explained leading, quote, new conservative Irving Kristol in 1975, but much more a question of one's attitude toward liberal political and economic systems and toward liberal civilization in general. This is Kristol writing in the Wall Street Journal. So most histories of neoconservatism focus on neoconservatives' attitudes toward détente and human rights in the Soviet Union, but it was the neo that provided the occasion for its first major victory, Gerald Ford's appointment of Daniel Patrick Moynihan as a US ambassador to the UN. While in the 1980s and beyond, neoconservatives took pride in their dismissal of the UN's relevance and authorities, in the 1970s, they wanted to stay and fight for an institution they believed was worth saving and America's preeminent role within it. Now, Moynihan presented Kissinger with another problem. On the one hand, he agreed with Moynihan that what the third world did and said at the UN mattered, and that the US needed a strategy beyond saying no, as the neoliberals suggested. However, Moynihan had his own approach to dealing with the neo that was in direct conflict with Kissinger's. While Kissinger was able to rebuff the neoliberals' calls for free market bromides, he was less able to control Moynihan's invocations of third world states' human rights records to delegitimize the right they claimed to a greater share of the North's resources. So Moynihan's combative stance at the United Nations threatened Kissinger's attempt to articulate an approach to the neo more in line with Western Europe's. And their public and private disputes led to Moynihan's resignation in February 1976. However, this earned Moynihan tremendous popularity among the American public, who found compelling his assessment of the UN as a club of tin pot dictators and racist fanatics, denouncing the US in one breath and demanding money in the next. Again, this is Moynihan's presentation of the issues. So in turn, he was voted into the US Senate from New York State in an upset election and remained in the Senate until I think 2001. Hillary Clinton, I believe, took his seat. My third argument is that the North-South dialogue transformed the US approach to human rights. The Carter administration placed the North-South dialogue at the top of its international agenda, and noting this, in June 1976, the developing countries suspended North-South dialogue negotiations in the hope that a better deal could be struck with the apparently more sympathetic Carter. What Carter brings to the dialogue is human rights, and in particular, economic rights. Carter is well known for his sanctions of dictators in Latin America, but there is also an economic component to his human rights package that has been almost entirely overlooked in human rights scholarship. Undersecretary of State Warren Christopher explained, quote, a policy which subordinated economic rights would not only be inconsistent with our humanitarian ideals and efforts, but would also be unacceptable in the third world, where the tendency is to view basic economic and social rights as the most important rights of all. So economic rights would take the form of a concept known as basic human needs. The idea emerged in the early 1970s during a time of crisis for the development community, finally admitting that large-scale modernization programs have been costly failures in many cases, with some GDP growth, but little effect on poverty and inequality within nations. So the idea with basic needs was for aid that would target specific health, education, nutrition, and other objectives, including in a few more years, women and gender, as well as increased local participation in environmental sustainability. If this sounds familiar to today's development paradigm, It's because they're a direct product of this transformation and development thinking. Now, the idea for the Carter administration was to use the economic aspect of its human rights policy, that is basic needs, to transform the North-South dialogue, and with it, the future of global political relations. This is how an NSC staffer put it to National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski in early 1977, Carter administration's first year. North and South have long feuded over the divergent emphases in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the North emphasizing personal, civil, and political rights, the developing countries' basic economic rights. The US can take a major step forward toward closing this, quote, values gap by embracing jointly the concept of human rights and basic human needs, and by proposing a major development program to see that the fulfillment of basic human needs is achieved throughout the world by the end of the century. So this is a very important distinction. While Kissinger wanted to water the NIO down, or NEO down, and Simon and Moynihan wanted to reject it in both form and spirit, Carter wanted to transform it. This would be attempted in two ways. First, in North-South negotiations like the Conference on International Economic Cooperation, or CIEC, which took place from 1975 to 77, involving 8 developed countries and 19 developing countries. Carter's State Department explained, the CIEC is an early phase of our attempt to refashion the North-South dialogue along our preferred lines. Our long-term objective is to modify the North-South dialogue and move it away from an emphasis on restructuring the international economic system to a pragmatic search for ways to improve it. But this didn't work for reasons made clear in the second way that Carter wanted to transform the North-South dialogue, through cooperation on human rights and development with key neo-leaders, especially the president of Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez. Carter sought to work with Pérez for several reasons. Pérez was both an OPEC leader who defied its 1973 boycott, continued to ship oil to the US, that is, and 1975 UN resolution on apartheid in Israel. He was also, at the same time, a vocal neo-supporter who embraced political democracy and individual human rights. His administration was filled with veteran UN diplomats who served in key roles in UN economic institutions, particularly Finance Minister Manuel Perez Guerrero, who was a Secretary General of UNCTAD, and then at the time, co-chair of the CIEC. So Carter and Perez actually made some real progress on human rights, but Perez, speaking for many developing countries, correctly suspected that Carter wanted to turn the conversation away from the structural issues at the heart of the NEO, that is the inequality governing production and trade between countries, and toward poverty, that is the distribution of resources within a country. This quote from a 1978 meeting between Carter, Perez, and Perez Guerrero captures this essential and ultimately unbridgeable divide perfectly. Perez Guerrero from UNCTAD says, since the CIEC, virtually nothing has happened. What worries us is that the North-South dialogue has stagnated. We have the impression that the US was more inclined to defend the status quo than create new solutions. There seem to be at times those who look to poverty as the problem rather than structural changes. But while poverty and the need for aid should be attended to, a change in the rules of the game to permit nations to develop more equitably was also important. And this is my quote, my favorite quote from this: concern over the poor is understood, but poverty is a symptom, not a cause. So you see the structural debate at the heart of the NEO that goes back to Bretton Woods. We haven't talked too much about the actual economic proposals debated in the North-South dialogue, which, as Richard said, took place mostly in UNCTAD, but also outside, like CIEC. For the sake of time, I've also left a few discussions that make up large parts of the book, like technology transfer and sustainable development, as well as other issues in US foreign policy that the NEO impacted, including the apartheid and the Panama Canal. But I do want to talk about some of the economic issues at stake with the time I have left, because it's very important for my conclusion. When the NEO was announced in 1974, commodity prices and the idea of an intergovernmental common fund to stabilize them was the South's and UNCTAD's highest priority. That began to change later in the decade as so-called petrodollars from OPEC flooded Western banks, who lent them out eagerly to both middle-income countries in Latin America and much poorer countries in Africa. Some of these countries, like Mexico, were also oil exporters, while others faced stiff oil bills in the wake of OPEC's 1973 shock. Matters were also made worse for these countries by high food prices, US protectionism, in northern efforts to fight inflation that decreased foreign demand and drove interest rates to historic highs. And here, I think, is the biggest legacy of the US policy toward the neo. I talk a lot more about the Reagan administration's involvement in the last chapter, and I'm happy to elaborate on that after. But it was in August 1982, less than a year after the last North-South dialogue meeting in Cancun, Mexico. This is Ronald Reagan's and Margaret Thatcher's first and last North-South dialogue meetings. It's in August 1982 that the Southern Coalition really dies, and with it, any real collective movement for change or resistance to the global economic order that scares rich countries. And I'm speaking of the Latin American debt crisis, which started first in Mexico in August 1982 and quickly spread across the continent and into Africa and parts of Asia. This event kicked off what economists have called the lost decade of development for the South due to the lack of growth and increase in poverty. It's also known as the time when neoliberalism emerged with a vengeance in the form of structural adjustment loans, in which the over-leveraged banks provided the money for loans to debtors and the IMF enforced the terms. And this moment marks a radical new diplomatic constellation in which private banks were given extraordinary powers to shape poor countries' economic policies, as well as effective protection from major losses in those countries. Of course, the developed countries claim to be stunned by the historic and unprecedented debt crisis. US officials initially argued that it was a, quote, temporary problem of liquidity brought on by unsound domestic policies that could be contained by a bit of cash and policy reforms. Reagan officials dismissed debt relief as encouraging moral hazard. Instead, the expectation was that once reforms were in place, private capital would have the confidence to return. But in the end, American officials' focus on defeating the South's proposals for global reform left them blind to the global crisis brewing right in front of them. At UNCTAD 4 in 1976, Secretary General Gamani Correa warned of an impending debt crisis in the South if action were not taken soon. A year later, at CIEC, co-chairman Manuel Perez Guerrero of Venezuela and formerly of UNCTAD insisted on behalf of the group of 19 developing countries at CIEC that the meeting discuss the debt problem and reach an agreement on a new framework for debt renegotiation and rescheduling. The Carter administration agreed to some debt relief for the least developed countries on a case-by-case basis, but as late as 1979, where at UNCTAD 5, debt resurfaced once again, US officials believed, that is Carter administration officials believed, quote, official debt is of political importance to LDCs out of proportion to its economic significance. So by the time the debt crisis hit a couple of years later, the consensus on markets, the state, and development in the US, IMF, and World Bank had moved decisively in favor of the neo's greatest critics, who were the neoliberals and neoconservatives who began the 1970s on the fringes of American foreign policy and the US foreign policy establishment, and emerged victorious in the early 1980s as its new center. So the final irony of all of this, which I discuss in the epilogue using a lot of data from Thomas Piketty, Branko Milanovic, and Emmanuel Saiz and Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley. The final irony is that under neoliberal globalization, inequality has increased dramatically in the United States and other rich countries in a way that has actually undermined their citizen support for an open international economy. And in the United States, especially for leadership of the so-called liberal international order. So I'll leave it there and happy to answer any questions about any of this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. There are a couple of questions, again, you might want to take a look at in the Q&A session. And I have to say, I'm looking forward to the book after that presentation. There's a lot of detail of UNCTAD's own history that I'm not myself fully aware of. One of the issues you raised there, of course, is that which was important in the new international economic order was issues around technology transfer, where UNCTAD has always played a pretty central role. And there's an interesting morphing, I think, of the human rights agenda with the neoliberal agenda. And that's around the notion of intellectual property rights, which is also seen as a particular right for a particular group of not so disadvantaged people, but a human right in a certain sense nonetheless. And I think that might be a useful way of bringing in Susan Sell's contribution to our discussion. Susan is a professor of political science at Australian National University, previously at George Washington University in the US, has worked on a wide variety of issues around global political economy, but with, I think, a very particular and incredibly useful focus on the way in which intellectual property has become a central framing tool for the neoliberal, hyperglobalized economic order, and of course has become incredibly important, and the problems it has posed for developing countries have become heightened in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we're seeing the whole debate now around access to vaccines as a critical issue in the North-South dialogue in the WTO, for example. So I think this would be a good moment to kind of look at how some of these issues that have been bubbling around the discussions of a new international economic order remain current in the current discussions about the challenges that developing countries are facing in the face of the particular difficulties that have been unleashed by COVID-19. So Susan, you have the screen.
Thank you. All right, so is this working? Can everyone see me? Can everyone see me and hear me?
We can see and hear you. Are you trying to use the screen, Susan, or not?
Yeah, do you see us slides?
I don't see slides, no.
I put share screen up. I'm sorry. Share screen.
I think maybe Claire can help. There you go.
Oh, thank you, Claire. Sorry about that. Anyway, so thanks so much for including me. Can everyone see this now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So thanks for including me. And this is a really good, I loved the two presentations before, and this is a good segue into now, coming up to speed of where we are now. And UNCTAD has always been interested in questions of inequality and technology transfer, and we're seeing a lot of those elements haven't gone away, and they're shown to be so important in the case of COVID. So what I'm going to do is talk about what's different about 21st century capitalism as post-Reagan. So Michael, thank you for leaving us there. And I would argue that it's profoundly different, and it's causing new sets of problems. And yeah, so I'd like to advance the slide. Thank you. Okay, so what's new? Talking about COVID and capitalism. I'll talk about what's new, what the distinctive features are of 21st century capitalism and make it different than what we saw last century. Talk a bit about medical neoliberalism, and then capitalism and COVID. So that's what I'm doing. And next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Can I do that? Yeah, okay, so what's new? What's new is financialized capitalism, which Eric has written extensively about. Another thing that's new are vertically integrated global value chains, and we've seen the effects of that when we ran out of PPE and vaccine components and testing components. The dominance of intangibles, which include things like financial instruments, intellectual property, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then we've seen a big rise in economic concentration. So financialized capitalism is where profits accrue mainly through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. So rather than goods and services, the profits are really all about finance and they're more disarticulated from the real economy. And you can see how finance can crash the real economy, as we saw in the global financial crisis. What we've also seen is a huge increase in economic concentration, and you can see just the big rise in this. And Thomas Piketty has written about this, as Michael was mentioning, but this is extraordinary. And you can see how sharp the top 1% gains are right here in the red line. So inequality and poverty, since 1960, the global inequality income gap has roughly tripled. We've seen, obviously, in COVID, it's made it so plain, the unequal access to healthcare. And as we saw in the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and we're seeing now, preventable deaths. There's a lot of unnecessary death, and part of that has to do with intellectual property. So the top 1% controls 46% of the world's wealth, and it still doesn't seem to be enough for the top 1%. And the rest of the world has really been left behind in very sharp and obviously devastating ways, especially in COVID. It's just brought it to the forefront. Oops. Thank you. So my argument is that we really need to look at 21st century capitalism and look at the global economy from 30,000 feet. What are the big structural pictures? And it was interesting, Michael was pointing out how US policymakers really wanted to avoid talking about the rules and talking about the structural elements. And it's easier to focus on poverty, which is a symptom, as he rightly pointed out. So I think we really need to take this big structural picture to understand what's going on. And some of the structural changes that we've seen are big increase in the role of finance, big increase in the role of intangibles like intellectual property and services, for example, also increase in economic concentration, as I mentioned. And at the same time, we've seen a sharp decrease in the power of labor and the public provision of what we tend to think about as public goods. So there's been a lot of private actors moving into spaces that primarily had been state functions, from prisons to hospitals, anything you can imagine. So public provision and the power of labor has really dropped. And so what are the features of 21st century capitalism? One is what John Braithwaite calls Wall Street capitalism, and this covers financialization. The second is intellectual monopoly capitalism. The owners of intellectual property have enormous power. We see the rise of oligopolies. And also in terms of labor, we see labor flexibility or casualization, where security for labor has dropped dramatically with the gutting of unions under Reagan. So these are some of the distinctive features: Wall Street capitalism and intellectual monopoly capitalism. I would add digitalization to that, but that's not on today's menu. But those are the three distinctive features. So financialization has really changed the behavior of non-financial corporations and changed the incentives for companies. Shareholder value is what they're supposed to serve, increasing the returns and profits to shareholders. The pharmaceutical industry has totally changed the way it does business as a result of this. And it's had a very negative impact on access to medicines and personal protective equipment, as we've seen during the COVID pandemic. And this is a very powerful graphic, I think, that captures a lot of what I'm talking about. And this was invented by or created by the head of Acer Computers, Samuel Shin, I think his first name was. Anyway, the smiling curve, this really captures what's changed, what's different. So if you think about how a product is made, it starts with some research and development, and then it moves into design. Then we have logistics and purchasing, you get contracts to purchase whatever you're making. And then here's production, where you actually produce the goods. So these up here are intangible activities, pre-production areas. And then production, this is actually making the good, making the product. And then post-production, we have logistics, distribution, shipping, all of that. Then marketing, and at the top here, services, and also brands. So managing your brand. And the thing to note about this, a couple things. So value chain activities going from R&D all the way to services like the Apple store after you buy a product, and brand management, the trademarks. But the thing to notice about this is in the 1970s, this value chain was much flatter. And what that means is the value added here, those who reap the biggest benefits from the current system are those who control the intangibles, those that have the intellectual property for the R&D. They have patents for medicines, that's really important, and also trademarks here. So it's these intangible things at the top. These are the people that are getting the most benefit. They're getting the most return on their activities. And they're very light labor. They don't have a lot of labor. The labor's all down here. And what we see is the steepening of the smile. In the 70s, there wasn't a really huge difference between, say, executive pay and the average worker in the United States. But what we see now is a much steepening of this. And what's happened is there's less competition up here for the owners of intangibles, less competition, companies like Apple and Google, we've seen all this economic concentration. But at the bottom here, where production happens, this is labor, there's intense competition. And developing countries in particular compete to try to be part of this global value chain. And, in terms of what's the value added, it's really the returns to people at these different parts in the curve. So here, Apple, might make $1,500 per iPhone, but Foxconn, who actually produces the actual iPhone, gets just pennies on the dollar. And so what's happened here is a steepening where labor gets less, production gets less return, and those owners of intangible get the lion's share of all the profits. And they control the control of intangibles, intellectual property. They control this value chain, and they also reap the most reward from it. And as a result, and we see this change here, especially with intellectual property and finance, we see this change of a very sharp steepening of this curve in the 2000s. And that helps us to understand inequality and how sharp the changes have been that I suggested earlier. I think that's a really helpful graphic to understand a lot of things about the contemporary economy. So financialization, we have the increased political and economic power of owners of intangibles, those who control these global value chains, and they can dictate terms of trade and investment agreements to shore up oligopoly and oligopsony power. And for example, trade agreements are not really about trade anymore. They're mostly about protecting intellectual property rights and protecting the rights of investors against sovereign governments, private actors. So, the power of these actors mean that trade agreements and investment agreements are really serving their needs rather than actually being about trade the way that, so it's really a different system. And then medical neoliberalism, it's changed medical practice, medical research in so many ways. But with deregulation of Wall Street in the 1980s, we switched to a shareholder value model. And this means you're trying to get the most returns for your investors. And so we had a big shortage of vaccines, just standard, childhood vaccines in the 1970s and 80s. And there was testimony by a guy from Merck who had been president of Merck back in the day, Merck Pharmaceutical Company. And he was testifying before Congress because they were saying, what's up with this vaccine shortage? And they used to make vaccines. And he said, I can't invest in vaccines anymore because I'm going to be subject to a hostile takeover, and they're going to bring in an executive that's just about making the profits rather than producing vaccines, because the low profit margins with vaccines. So these vaccine shortages were partly a function of the shareholder value model. And another thing that happened at the same time was a reduced antitrust enforcement. And what we saw in the 1980s was a huge wave of mergers and acquisitions. And this helped to create that economic concentration. And the Reagan administration in particular weakened antitrust enforcement or competition policy, which was a big part of the NIEO, the competition negotiations for a code of conduct. But, you know, suddenly, Reagan said, oh, we have to be competitive in global markets. So we don't really care if there's a lot of economic concentration at home, because we'll be better able to compete globally. And so they relaxed antitrust enforcement under the Chicago School of Economics. We also saw TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, and TRIPS Plus. Ever since the Uruguay round, the US and its private businesses it's representing have done nothing but increase the intellectual property protection using bilateral agreements, regional agreements. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was all about increasing intellectual property rights way beyond TRIPS and reducing flexibilities of other countries to utilize intellectual property that's owned by others. And this has had a big effect on vaccine development, which, you know, the chickens have come home to roost with COVID. So in the 1990s, vaccine patents rose tenfold, even as production declined. So there was a massive, you know, with TRIPS, and there was a massive move to patent as much as you could, write those patents as broadly as you could to exclude other people from using your knowledge. That it gives you the right to exclude. And that is really the power of intellectual property. So it's led to vaccine shortages. And what we've seen is with COVID is that producing and distributing doses requires massive government intervention. The private market is not serving us well. And the tight grip on the intellectual property, the patents on this publicly funded research, I might add, means that you have to get a license from the owners of this, and they're not licensing it to very many places. So we have an undersupply of vaccines because they're unwilling to share that technology, and they're unwilling to license it to more and more producers, and that's causing a lot of bottlenecks, not just with vaccines, but also vials, syringes. The N95 masks that everybody needs right now for the pandemic, there are like 300 or 400 patents on the technology behind those masks. And there's only 3 companies in the US that owns that technology. So it's created all these bottlenecks that are leading to a lot of unnecessary death. So, you know, this was a lot like the HIV/AIDS crisis of the late 1990s and early 2000s, but the question is who's left to die? We've seen vaccine nationalism where the rich countries have hoarded the vaccines. Some have many more doses than they need to even serve their population. And then, you know, philanthrocapitalism, people like Bill Gates or, you know, there's a big movement around that. But in fact, philanthrocapitalism is not sustainable. It's dangerous. And you can't really rely on the whims of a billionaire to serve the public good. It's not a sustainable result. And we need to have much more structural change in order to make these things available that everybody needs. The other thing that capitalism is, or COVID has shown us about capitalism is, again, going to the bottom of that smile curve about inequality and working conditions. So now we have the new risk workers, or essential workers, we call them now, but these are communities of color for the most part in the Western world. And they're the precariat, the recent immigrants. And, you know, during COVID, we realized how much we rely on these workers, and they've been the most exposed. They've been at the front lines. And I'll just show you a couple of pictures of their working environments and how difficult their circumstances are. this is a meat packing plant, and they have to work cheek to jowl right next to each other. These are mostly immigrants that work these jobs. You can't have socially distanced. You have to yell because it's very loud. And so you're, you've got particulates coming out of your mouth. And, there were many COVID infections in meatpacking plants. And you can see why with these working conditions. They're poorly paid. They weren't given the right PPE. And very cynically, after some people died in a chicken processing plant in the United States, the owners of the plant, and so people were scared to come to work, but the owners of the plant were offering $300 bonuses if you came to work, which is, what price do you put on a person's life? I mean, the meatpacking plants were ground zero for a lot of the infections. Another example is the Amazon. This is an Amazon fulfillment center. And you can see how close they have to work together. They weren't given PPE. And this one guy in New Jersey at an Amazon fulfillment center organized some protests, that we really need to have the proper sanitization and the PPE. And he got fired for daring to, bring that up. And then here's a grocery worker, very important. Also, everyone was relying on grocery workers to stock the shelves so people could eat. And here they are sanitizing, but they don't have health benefits. They don't have secure employment. They can't afford to stay home. They can't work remotely. And these are the workers that have really been on the front line. And it also shows systemic racism in that these are many people of color or new immigrants. And so they've been disproportionately harmed. So capitalism and COVID, we're talking about globalization, economic interdependence. The global supply chains are very intertwined, as we've seen, concentration of economic and political power. But the Wall Street and monopoly capitalisms are really powerfully shaping the global political economy, but there are some options for reform. So I've said many negative things, but it's also an opportunity to think about what could we do better or different. So here, and these slides will be available to you. I don't want to go through each and every point, but one is relaxing patent rights, especially in a pandemic. There's talk about a pandemic treaty. There's talk at the World Trade Organization of waiving patent rights for the pandemic. And this would be a good first step and to allow for all sorts of flexibilities so that there'd be more people producing the things everybody needs, like vaccines, for example, PPE, to help get us out of this pandemic. And I'm not going to go through these examples. You'll see them on the slide, but there have been some good examples of governments actually taking steps to reduce patent rights in order to make drugs affordable. And there have been examples of it. And interestingly, France and Germany have engaged in some things accusing, trying to enforce antitrust, also making, using government marching rights to seize the patents of owners so they can produce things. And, even developed countries, I don't like those words, but even rich countries are realizing it's a problem, but are not really supporting the developing world or the global South, as you can see with the vaccine inequality. So these are, I'm going to just flip through these. These are just more examples, but they'll be on the slides and you can, look at those examples later in the interest of time. So competition law, the EC has used some antitrust action to try and get COVID testing kits. So, there's a recognition that this is an obstacle, it's a barrier, but they're not making the big structural changes that would benefit everybody. Going back to the rules, that's what's important. So wealthy countries are recognizing these tensions, but they're not fully supporting what South Africa and India have been asking for, which is waiving patent rights for COVID in the World Trade Organization. Those talks are ongoing, but they're very slow. They're way too slow for what we need right now. So what we found is a big role of governments in search for vaccines for COVID. I think the Moderna vaccine was 100% government funded, but these firms are making all the profits. There's 9 new vaccine billionaires. Well, all these people are unnecessarily dying. And it's because they have control of the top of that smile curve. They have control of that intellectual property. And it's certainly showing the problems with the way that the system is structured right now. So, you know, some of the things that I think we need to think about in terms of moving forward on COVID, there's different regulatory approaches, but also, you know, in terms of the way we think about the way we live, I think we need to repair tattered social bonds. I think the whole neoliberal, libertarian, I, me, mine, it's all about the individual has been devastating in a pandemic. So we need to reimagine community and try to reconnect. So we have to repair these social bonds that I think that ideology has really destroyed. We're also seeing that social safety is a legitimate public responsibility. You know, the way the Biden administration is rolling out the vaccines, I mean, there's a role for government there. And we've spent all these years listening to saying, you know, the government's useless, make it smaller, the private sector, the market's going to solve all problems. We're seeing how much that's false in this pandemic. And the response has been massive mobilization of public actors. And so I think we also need to focus on the rules. That's the most important thing, not to demonize particular actors or whatever, but it's really that big structural picture that I want to highlight. And COVID just shows us the negative effects of the way things are structured. And I think it's also interesting, and it's an opportunity to think of what an economic bioethics might look like. But I think it's important to think about how large structural changes like financialization and consolidation and intellectual property rights intersect with medical research and practice, and to understand the pathologies that we see and the opportunities going forward. Thank you. I will stop it there.
Susan, great. Thanks a lot. We're running out of time, and I know the follow-up session is about to start. I'm just going to ask you all maybe one question. I mean, I'll start with you, Susan, but the same question maybe to everybody. Yeah, I mean, the rules of the game are the problem. I think, I mean, UNCTAD, we've been arguing that in our work now for some time. They're stacked against individuals in the north and they're stacked against countries in the south. But political actors matter, right? And you're all of you are on the other side of the Atlantic right now. And there's a lot of talk about Biden, you know, the sea change that is coming or has begun with the Biden administration. And you're in this area, I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk, Susan, about his willingness to take on big capital. I mean, his tax policies, the talk about the need for regulating the digital platform. I mean, he's made strong noises. I just wonder, you know, if there's something optimistic in the new administration that, you know, we need to kind of build on and not only focus it on the American situation, but to think about it as a set of global challenges that offer new opportunities for a progressive agenda that has a global perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and I did focus on America because, you know, they were the originators of a lot of these rules, and some of the most powerful actors in the global economy are these firms like Apple and Google and Facebook, but yeah, there is a change, but I want to be optimistic. I do, and there's a lot of focus around the world about tech and how to regulate tech, but I don't want it to be limited to that. But I just think that we need to point out and advocate for a constructive role of the public sector, failures of the market, and the very devastating and fatal focus on intellectual property in the case of a pandemic. So I think it's an opportunity to really have that deeper structural conversation, and we have to keep pushing that. I mean, I thought things were going to change after the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and they didn't, you know. But I think this is an opportunity, and but it's going to be a tough to undo all that, but it's definitely, we need to capitalize on this moment to get people to really see it. It's shown us how bad things are for people. And so I think it's a really good opportunity.
Susan, and there's questions in the Q&A if you have time to just respond to any of them. I think you can access them from you. But Michael, same to you. I mean, is there any chance of a coalition to think about a new international economic order? And we, in recent work in the Trade and Development, we talk about a global Green New Deal, which, I think of being a 21st century answer to the equivalent to the new international economic order, changed circumstances, new challenges, but we frame it in those terms coming from where we do. Is that pie in the sky?
It's a great question, and I also I do have more optimism in the Biden administration, not just compared to the Trump administration, but also compared to the Obama administration, and in particular on climate policy. So let me say where I'm optimistic first, and where I'm heartened, and then let me say where I'm disheartened and think change is not coming. So where I'm heartened is definitely on climate multilateralism. They have some pretty serious thinkers on this side looking at the adaptation issue, which is very important in the South for climate change, and something that the North just didn't want to talk about for a long time. Here's where I see the same things happening of the US and global economic negotiations, and I very much see global climate change negotiations as ones about trade finance and development, or who's going to pay for what. And what we've seen from the Biden administration, despite a higher ambition than even some aspects of the Obama administration on climate, is still the lowest common denominator function of the US within the rich country coalition. So this happened all the time in the 1970s, and Europe, they complain about this, but they really like it, because it means that they can announce a more ambitious decision, but the US is not going to go along, or wants to water it down and block it or something. So they're able to kind of get off the hook for some of the more ambitious things. This has happened all throughout the 90s in a lot of ways in climate. And one last example would be political actors do matter. And so the Green Climate Fund, which is the UNFCCC's development bank for climate. This didn't exist until Obama's term, I think in Copenhagen was where it was born. And Obama announced a bunch of money to it, I think 4 billion or something like that. The administration ended up delivering 1 billion. So Biden has followed that up and announced on Earth Day, part of his big Earth Day announcement this year, a bunch of money for the development finance. However, only a small portion of it is going to go to the multilateral GCF. The rest will go through the US's new Development Finance Corporation, which is a reorganization of US development policy that happened in 2018. The money promised to the Green Climate Fund is, I think, about the same as the Obama administration, but it's still, the US is still 2 or 3 billion behind. So the promise is one thing, we'll see what's delivered. The most disheartening thing is, of course, I think the North response to COVID in the South, that it's just completely off the radar of most foreign policy, even foreign policy elites. So I'll stop there.
Michael, thanks. Eric, just to pick up and maybe Eric on, I mean, I guess the pessimism that we have, and to some extent against what Michael just said, is the entrenched power of finance in this world that doesn't seem to, and it's morphing and it's adaptation to some of the pressures from below. What Daniela Gabor calls the Wall Street consensus seems to be as entrenched about. Larry Fink went to Venice for the G20 finance ministers meeting and basically said, look, you give us the money and we'll solve the climate crisis, essentially. And I don't hear anything from the Biden administration along the lines that we heard from Roosevelt, right? When he said, the bankers hate me and I welcome their hatred, in a famous comment, I think, in the 1930s. You know, it's very, are the political elites and those that are worried about the direction of the global economy really willing to take on finance in a way that would allow this kind of progressive agenda to take hold?
Yeah, it's obviously an impossible question to answer, but you know, thinking about it in the long historical context, one thing that I find sometimes people exaggerate the extent to which, you know, everything was changed at Bretton Woods in a kind of big bang way, that if you can just get the right ideas and the right people in the room, you can change the world. But even that moment, you know, which had the wartime and all these very special circumstances, it grew out of about a 10-year process of new ideas and new coalitions being formed and institutional innovations at the margin, all of which then culminates in what we see in retrospect as a kind of big bang, a moment of innovation. I think we're just living through that right now. Since 2008, things have been changing. You know, it's important to remember how the world was before 2008. And I would say at the level of ideas, at the level of institutional innovation, and I would also say at the level of coalition formation, there've been a lot of changes. And it just takes time. And, you know, it takes time within countries, but at the international level, you know, changes in global governance really take a lot of time. And so, you know, that's my more optimistic note, just to say that incrementalism is the way that change moves forward in global economic governance. And I think we are in the middle of a period of incremental change.
Great. Look, thanks very much. We've gone way over time, but this was a great way, I think, to kick off the sessions of the summer school. I think a lot of these questions and issues will come back in subsequent panels. So let me just close by thanking you all for taking the time to participate in this opening session. And of course, to everyone who's sat and listened to these presentations. I hope you find them stimulating and interesting, and I certainly did. So again, thanks to everybody for participating, and please make sure that you continue to register for subsequent sessions of the summer school. So thanks a lot, everyone.